In this video, we're going to be talking about iOS developer interview trends in 2024. The question that you're probably going to get in almost every single round is tell me about yourself, or someone asking you for an introduction or something like that. Now, you might think that this is an easy question, and to some extent it is, but this isn't an improvisation where you're going to talk for 10 minutes about different subjects and random things. What you're basically here to do is effectively communicate a brief summary of your current position, some of your work history, and why you're applicable for the job. You're hoping to get through this in about 1 to 3 minutes, and it definitely helps to rehearse this several times because it will set the tone for each individual round. If you start off your tell me about yourself and it's kind of wishy-washy, the interviewer might think the candidate isn't particularly strong at communication, and that might set you on the back foot from the get-go. So you really want to nail this one, and things will go a lot smoother for you. Tell me about a problem and how you overcame it is such a common question that it's in many interview books, and it's super important that you have like 1 to 2 stories that can relate to this question, and hopefully they're based in reality. If you make a story up that's complete fiction, whenever the interviewer probes you on questions or pros and cons as to why you made certain decisions, if you just completely made it up, it's probably not going to work out too well for you, and in many cases can completely ruin your whole interview if they find out that you just made it up. So I would encourage you to use a realistic or real situation that you were actually in and not make something up. So with these kinds of questions, there's a specific template that they're looking for in many companies. Some companies don't necessarily care about the template, but other ones do. It's called the STAR method, and it's called STAR because it stands for situation, task, action, result, and sometimes this last R is reflection. The first S is where you just generally describe the situation. So you could say like, hey, I was in a situation in my team. We had 4 days to deliver something for an important client, and the UI in the application was not performant to our standards, and it was causing a lot of problems for our design team, and our product manager certainly was not happy. Whenever you get to the T part, this is specifically where you want to say what you did, what your task was, rather. So you'll say, like, I was tasked with coming up with a solution within this very short deadline. And it was important that we came up with some solution because there was a lot of important money related to the contract for this specific thing. And if we didn't do this, there would be penalties for my bonuses as well as the larger team. Kind of like painting a dark story here. The action, you could say like, so I looked into it. Again, you want to say specifically what you did, not we, which for some people might be a little uncomfortable, but unfortunately it is what is required. So you'll say like, I was tasked to look into this, and I found that what we could do is take our views that were in SwiftUI and apply some workarounds to mitigate most of the performance problems, or we could also convert everything back to UIKit in a UI collection view. What I decided to do instead is to just apply some workarounds in SwiftUI to introduce some representables, to use a little bit of UIKit inside of our SwiftUI to make everything perform smoothly, and that wouldn't take too much time at all. The result, you'll say like, okay, I was able to deliver this for the team, and it was an amazing success. From this, we learned that whenever we're in the situation, I'm kind of like dipping into the R here. From this, we learned that if we're ever in a situation where the performance of the UI is not satisfactory for like what people are expecting, we don't necessarily have to completely choose SwiftUI or UIKit. There are alternative approaches to blend the two. So with this kind of STAR template, you can get through a lot of these problems. And what you want to do is have probably, I would say 1 to 2, and you probably want to have these, I'm going to say less than 5 minutes, but it's going to be a fairly detailed story that you're going to go into. Coding is, of course, always going to be a pillar of iOS developer interviews, given that as a software engineer, you're probably writing code. But the actual style of coding challenge or code test that you're going to be given can vary wildly. So it really depends on the company. And if it's a startup or a FANG or a fintech or something like that, you want to sort of get a read on the situation, maybe do some research online as to what kind of questions you're expecting. But from what I've observed, there's basically a few different categories that you're going to get. So you're probably going to get something like a traditional coding challenge, right? So you've seen these. These are going to be like leak code, right? Everyone's seen leak code. And there's two famous lists of questions that people recommend. Blind 75, and there's another one called Grind 75, and these lists of questions were created by the same person. Blind 75 is the original one that gained a lot of popularity because it was like a nice list that people could study, and it felt like people had a plan to prepare themselves for coding challenges. Eventually, the creator subsequently was surprised by the popularity of Blind 75 and made another one called Grind 75. A lot of the problems are similar between Blind 75 and Grind 75, but it's not exactly the same list of problems. So for these, you're probably going to want to practice enough of these coding challenge problems to the point where you could probably get through most of the medium ones in about 20 minutes. And if you get an easy problem, hopefully you can get through them through like 5 or 10 minutes or something like that. And if you find that you're doing these problems and you're just not quite quick enough to be able to do these kinds of problems, you probably just need to do more of these problems. For some people, that could be 100 questions. For some people, it might be like 300 or 400 questions. There's a lot of resources out there, and I might consider doing some of this. Another kind of coding test is what I'm going to call the mini apps. The mini apps are very frequently something like, I want you to write me a network request in an app, and I want you to parse some JSON and render out a list. And when you click on the list, I want you to open this link or something like that. It's going to typically involve a lot of those basic fundamentals that I've mentioned, and you're going to see them time and time again. In some cases, it's going to be related to games. And I'm not talking about Call of Duty or anything like that, but it might be related to chess, Sudoku, or tic-tac-toe or something like that. But even more common than those games are going to be grid problems. And the reason why grid problems come up so often is that games kind of have an inherent disadvantage for anybody who doesn't quite know the game super well. So if you don't really understand chess super well and you're given a chess question, it might bias a certain candidate over another, which is why some companies like to avoid it. That being said, you could totally get a chess problem. Grid problems are great because you can't come into it with some kind of additional knowledge where, okay, well, uh, you've got some knowledge that you're bringing in that you're going to be able to apply to a grid problem. No, like the grid problem is usually something completely made up by the interviewer, such that you're going to have to think on the fly on how to solve it. So a great example that I'm going to show you here is something like this, where let's say I ask you to make an app here, and I want you to make a grid, and whenever you tap on a tile, it's going to invert the adjacent tiles. So I clicked on this tile and it inverted the adjacent tiles. So it started off all blue, and when I click on this tile right here, all the adjacent tiles vertically and horizontally become green. And if I click on this tile on the left, it's going to apply that same rule. It doesn't actually modify the tile I'm clicking on, but it will modify the adjacent tiles. And then if I click on like a boundary tile, it's going to ignore the boundary tiles that are out of bounds. And you could sort of come up with some kind of test like this. In this case, I've asked for like a reset button or something like that, but you're going to see a lot of grid problems, and they're super important to get fairly good at. So you probably want to be good with SwiftUI Grid, and if you're doing them in UIKit, you probably want to know how to set that up, but SwiftUI is probably less code. You don't necessarily need to use the SwiftUI Grid. You could probably just bang out all of this with for eaches and stuff like that. It's just that you need to be able to develop stuff like that on the fly pretty quickly. In system design rounds, I've seen a lot of variability, and it really, again, depends on the company you're applying to. You might get something classic, like a traditional question, like design me a vending machine. This says vending machine, I promise you. And in this kind of question, you're kind of leading the discussion, right? You can look these up on YouTube. You're sort of putting a bunch of squares down, you're connecting things, you're describing what is responsible for what, so on and so forth. You're asking clarifying questions, so on and so forth. This you sometimes will get, but surprisingly, you don't always get these kinds of questions, right? You might actually get something a little bit more practical. So they might say, design an app with these features, right? So they might say like, all right, I want you to design me an app that can make purchases to buy different colored balls, and I also want to ensure that we have an analytics capability in there, so we can track what kind of balls are purchased, what kind of things might lead up to that. So we want to understand basically what events lead to more of our users purchasing balls. And so with that kind of thing, you might use TCA, you might use MVVMC or whatever architecture that you're comfortable with, and you're going to break down the problem, ask clarifying questions, provide solutions, and attack the problem to make sure that all of the requirements that the interviewer is asking for have been satisfied. And bonus points if you can talk about dependency inversion and how to abstract things away, talk about testability, of course, so on and so forth. So this is very similar to the vending machine one. It's just that it relates more specifically to how you might do that in an iOS app. I hope you've gotten a little bit of help out of this video. It was not intended to be exhaustive. These are just observations that I've seen or heard from different developers interviewing at different companies. And again, I want to emphasize, really depends on the company that you're interviewing for. That will dictate the style of questions or the style of interview that you're going to go through. Good luck.